Everybody. Today's topic is population ecology. And we're specifically interested in population ecology in only looking at one population typically. So remembering from our population and species discussion, all the individuals within one population will be of the same species, but they may be somewhat isolated from other such groups. So as scientists, we want to study a population. That's one way of saying we can look at this particular regional area or group of individuals of the species that we expect to be interacting with one another, mating with one another, having behaviors where they're interacting. In this lecture, we're going to talk about a definition of populations and some of the ways that when we go out into the world and look at them, that we measure about them. And then we're going to focus on the things that happen to populations. Basically, looking at the total size of the population, how many individuals are there, and whether that size is increasing, decreasing, or staying the same. The reason why that happens has to do with the interaction between the organism's life history strategy and its environment. So the life history strategy is sort of how does it go about surviving, growing, and reproducing over the course of its life? Does it have a short lifespan versus a long lifespan? Does it have a lot of offspring at once or only one at a time? Then we'll look at what we expect to see in populations. We can mathematically model a couple of things that could happen to populations, and we'll look at the ways that we can describe those. And then we'll talk about what's happening to the human population and how this relates to what we know about how populations behave in general. All right, so first we want to define some things that we want to know about the population. And that's going to be some group of individuals of the same species that are somewhat isolated from other groups. So for example, we could have a population of mountain lions or pumas, and there's a group of them that live in the Los Angeles area. So this map is showing the home ranges or areas where each individual mountain lion has been found. So the outlines show the individuals by their tag numbers, and we can see that most of them use different large regions of the habitat. So if you're familiar with this landscape, it's quite a long drive to go from the south end of this figure to the north end. And each individual may or may not have some overlap with other individuals in their territory. So this word territory is the one that means another way we can say a home range. So a territory would be a place where an individual would be found, and it's going to defend that against other individuals. So when we look across a map, the spatial pattern of where we see individuals is one thing that's important in studying a population. And if you're trying to study more than 2 or 3 mountain lions, you're going to have to drive across a pretty large piece of the landscape in order to do it. So in some of them, their territories overlap. Usually we have males and females that might have territories that overlap, whereas males and males are not usually going to have territories that overlap. In general, when we look at individuals of the same population across the landscape, there's 3 different ways that we could describe a pattern of where we see individuals besides that they hold specific territories. So when we see lots of individuals in a fairly small location and they're really close together, then we'd say they're clumped. So in the picture at the top, we see the starfish, the red and the orange and purple 5-armed animals. They're clumped together because their food source is there. We may also find individuals clustered together if they form a social group, like a herd of deer or of caribou. We may see them spaced out from one another at regular distances. So our penguins are showing that they each have a personal space and they want to have all the other penguins stay apart from them, and they're going to defend that space. If a penguin shuffles into that space, the other one's going to start to peck at it to make it go away. So more like our mountain lions. So they're going to defend territories. Now, these spaces are going to depend on the resources in the environment. So our penguins' territories are pretty uniform because all they want is a place to stand. They're just going to stand there with their eggs on their feet. They just want a little wing room around them. The territories of our mountain lions were different sizes because the resources in each of those locations are either good, in which case it may only need a small territory to have plenty of food available, or if the territory doesn't have as many food resources, the individual will have to defend or range over a larger area in order to get everything it needs. So depending on the quality of the habitat, territories may differ in size if that is how the habitat is used. Now we have other places where we're going to see that instead of individuals, mostly animals, moving in relation to one another or to their resources, we may see plants often distributed at random. So these seeds of these plants with the yellow flowers in the field fell. They were scattered across the landscape by wind, for example, and they fell in a particular place and they grew there. They didn't have any choice. They couldn't move anywhere else. And so we may see a random pattern of individuals in our population if they can't do locomotion. All right, so we're going to be interested in a couple things about our population. One of them is going to just be the number of individuals, the size of our population, and we're going to call that capital N, capital N. And we're also going to be interested in the density. So our capital N over some spatial scale, right? The density, the individuals per unit of area. If we have a dense population, we have more individuals in the same amount of space. And if we have fewer, then it's less dense. So we might measure territories also by area. And one of the things that we might be really interested in is how do individuals move around in the habitat. So here's a cartoon that represents the way that we often use to identify individuals, like was used for the mountain lions, that was in the first figure, and that is we mark the individuals in some way. So if it's a large mammal, it might have a radio collar, it might have a tag or badge. We can now even do this on very, very small animals. The technology for marking and tagging has gotten really advanced. So when we do find an individual, I trap it in the wild, shoot it with a tranquilizer dart. You see this a lot in nature shows, that we want to mark the individual so that if we ever see it again, we know where it was when we first found it. So birds are also marked with bands. And so people who are in tracking programs with birds, when they catch them, they put a little metal bracelet on the bird, and that can stay on it for its whole life. And the metal band either has a number on it, or there's different colored ones that they use, and so they can tell what individual it is, or at least where it was captured and when. So they can track where the individual goes. So this is most used on fairly large animals, but it certainly doesn't need to be used on plants because they stay right where we left them. And marine organisms, the technology is getting better and better, so that say you've got a tag on a large pelagic animal like a shark or a whale, it's going to relay a GIS location to a satellite when the animal surfaces. So periodically you'll get updates on the location in real time even. All right, so we might want to do these studies where we capture the individual and we mark it, and then we recapture it. So often these are called MRM or uh, mark, release, recapture. There's a variety of different terms for it, but it's basically, it used to be called capture release study. So that's a really useful way to study populations if it's an organism that you can mark. All right, another way that populations may be distributed is a little more complicated. So this is an example that's going to illustrate this concept. And it's of butterflies in a small island in Northern Europe. And on this island, there are certain plants, and the plants have a random distribution. They're scattered in little clumps. So there's some plants, some places don't have plants, and there's these little clusters of them. So this plant is a plant that's used by a butterfly species. And so through the eyes of the butterfly, this landscape, this area is patchy, right? It has little habitat patches, like the patch you would sew over a hole in your jeans. And the patches are either going to be of unsuitable habitat or of suitable habitat, right? They're either going to have flowers or not have flowers. And there can be patches that are close together. They can be patches that are further apart. So when we go and we look across this kind of landscape, the animals are not using it continuously, right? They have isolated their use of the habitat into these little bits. They're not like mountain lions, they're ranging across the whole thing. So instead of having a continuously distributed population, we end up having a population of populations. It's almost like the population itself is made up of many of these much smaller little units. And that when we look at the way the butterflies use those patches, that we may have a patch with the plants on it, and we may have butterflies on that patch, or we may not have butterflies. So we say it's an occupied patch, and the dark dots are showing places where these scientists went out and they surveyed and they found the plants and they found the butterflies, versus an unoccupied patch. It's potential habitat for the species, but the species wasn't sitting on it right at that moment. And so the way that organisms use the habitat, it turns out to be fundamentally important to understand if they use the habitat this way. So we've given this style of habitat use a name. And so we say that this is a special kind of a population, and it functions as a meta population. Right? And a meta population is a fancy way of saying a population of populations, right? So that's important because the distance between the patches and how many are occupied versus unoccupied, and how often the butterfly's behavior allows them to move in between these habitat patches, are the things that are the most important in determining whether the population of this butterfly is going to survive or it's going to go extinct. And this concept of metapopulations applies to a fairly small number of species in general in undisturbed habitat. But remember when we were talking about conservation biology and the ways that humans are changing habitats that are having negative consequences and can lead to extinction. So one of those ways is habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. So a lot of the time where humans take over the use of a habitat, we don't concrete over it from one side to the other. Instead, we humans, we put ourselves down in patches on the habitat. If you imagine an aerial photo of San Diego, right, we've got the neighborhoods, and then we've got the canyons. And the canyons are sort of this undisturbed, more or less, habitat. And so those canyons start to function like little isolated island habitat patches. And so the whole region, all of the organisms are forced to function in a metapopulation setting. And so the connections between those habitat patches become incredibly important in allowing those species to persist across that landscape. Right? We have to have individuals able to get from one habitat patch to another in order for them to find mates, to find enough resources, and to avoid inbreeding or breeding with close relatives. Right, so this has turned out to be a really important concept in trying to understand what happens to populations, not necessarily that normally exist in this kind of a geographic structure, but that we have caused them to be living in it based on habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. All right, so when I was giving this lecture one semester, I thought to myself, I've seen these little pill bugs around campus roaming across the sidewalks, but that's not where they live. They live in the grass and in the landscaping areas where there's mulch and shrubs and shady places. And I started thinking about how we could do some actual research projects on how the roly-polies are using the landscape across Grossmont College campus. So here's a map of campus, and you can see that the college campus is also a fragmented habitat compared to a natural habitat. And all the little green spaces are places where roly-polies could live. And then they're separated by these concrete pathways. It's too hot and dry during the middle of the day for them to survive very long out on those concrete pathways. So I've done a few small experiments and projects with students already on campus, investigating the metapopulation dynamics. So we're interested in looking at how they use the habitat, which habitat patches are good habitat. Do they have a high density? Do they have a high population size in some areas versus others? And how much do they move from one place to another? So our first project was to try and mark them so that we could mark a bunch of them and release them and do this very standard kind of mark recapture study. But it turns out that the pill bugs are really small in the first place. It's not like a bear or a mountain lion. And so we were trying to put a little tiny mark of paint onto the roly-polies, but they're able to roll themselves up into a ball. And so what happened is, as the paint was drying, they tended to roll in a ball and then roll over, or the paint, if we got too much on it, it would prevent them from rolling up. And then these animals also are arthropods, and so they molt, right? So they have this exoskeleton, and we put a dot of paint onto it. If we wait too long before we find them again, they will have crawled out of their old exoskeleton and they'll have left the paint marker behind. So we actually spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out if there was a way to mark them. We tried all kinds of different methods, and we eventually gave up and moved on to some other projects that we could do, which is really frustrating, but also really interesting and fun. So we did an actual experiment comparing different potential marking methods, and there's a poster in the hallway that shows that work that students did. So that's another example of why we might be interested in metapopulations. All right, so those are the basic ideas about what populations are and how we want to measure them. So we have this value, capital N, our population size. And if we want to look at population more than once over any kind of time period, the first question we're going to ask is this population staying the same size? Is it increasing in size, or is it decreasing in size? So what are the reasons it might increase in size? Well, the individuals have offspring. So we're going to count births as additions to the population. We can also have, remember, populations are not completely isolated from other populations. We can have immigrants, we can have migration between the populations, and so we can have individuals coming in from an outside. So we can have immigrants with an I and two M's. What are the ways that our population might decrease? Well, individuals might die, right? They could die of old age, they could get eaten by a predator, these little birds could smack into a window and break their necks, they could have a disease. So deaths, and then the other way that can decrease population size is emigration, right? So emigration with an E and only one M is leaving, right? So we can use the word migration to generally describe movement between a population, but if we want to make a distinction between individuals coming from somewhere else into our population, we call those immigrants. And then if we have individuals leaving our population and going elsewhere, we call them emigrants, right? We don't hear that word as much. All right, so if we know what how many individuals we have right now, right? We're going to take our population size right now at time t, 2021, and we want to say, how many individuals are we going to have in our population next year, next time, t plus 1, right? We're going to add the births, and add the immigrants, and we're going to subtract the deaths and subtract the immigrants. All right, sometimes we'll say, okay, suppose I have a population that doesn't have any immigrants or emigrants, just to keep things simple. All right, so we're going to add births and subtract deaths. If we have an estimate of current population size, and we have an estimate of these BIDE variables, then we can say, we don't have to wait to measure the population next year, we can predict what it's going to be. So say for San Diego County, we have a census of how many individuals are here. We have some idea of how many babies are born from hospital records or from birth certificate registrations. We can estimate how many immigrants there are and emigrants based on, say, changes in driver's licenses or something like that. And then we can also measure deaths from death certificates as well. All right, so we can get an idea of what those values are on an average year, or we can look at them over longer periods of time, and we want to look for trends to see if they're increasing or decreasing. So those are the only 4 reasons why our population size would change, but it turns out that there's, if we want to get a really good idea, we really want to understand why, say our population size in San Diego is increasing, right? But is it increasing due to births or is it increasing due to immigrants? Right? So those would be sort of different reasons why we might have a change in our population size, and that would affect all different kinds of decisions the government needs to make about what kinds of services to provide, how many schools are we going to need, versus services that adults use, right? So this kind of information about populations was actually first used by cities, by governments. And the science, the study of how and why populations change, is called demography. So we use the word demographic to define a group that you might be a part of, right? So your age group or your income level might be a demographic grouping that an ad might target, right? So cars that are targeting people who want to drive a truck might have a different age, have a different gender than a minivan. All right, so all of these kinds of characteristics are considered demographic variables, and the people who study populations like this are often called demographers. All right, so when we look at a little more detail and we want to know, okay, are there differences between kinds of individuals in births? Or maybe older moms or younger moms, do they have more offspring, less offspring? Which individuals are more likely to die in a given year? Is it the younger ones? Is it the older ones, right? So instead of lumping everybody together in the population, now we want to start looking at if there's kinds of individuals that we can identify that have different birth rates, different death rates, right? Different immigration rates. Only young males may immigrate, for example, right? So we're going to look in a little more detail at some of these characteristics. And a useful tool in finding out what happens to individuals in a population is doing what's called a cohort. There we go. This graph is showing we have age across the bottom, and these are prairie dogs. These are a kind of rodent, kind of like a ground squirrel, and they don't have a very long life. You can see that the males, the oldest ones they had in this sample were 5 years. The females live longer, about 9 years. All right, so we have the number of survivors on the y-axis here. So that'd be capital N, the number of individuals. And the way we get a graph that looks like this is we collect or capture or release into the wild or count in some way, mark individuals. And we started out with 1,000 individuals that were marked in some way in this study. And then we try and recapture those same individuals over and over again every year until they're all dead. So this group of individuals that were all born at the same time, we're going to call that a cohort. And then as we're recording the data every year, we can learn a lot about what's going on with this species. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. It looks like I have my background blurred, and I'm going to have to change that because it is not working. There we go. All right. So table, the data for it. We're going to start with time 0, right, as our starting time. We're going to release these newborn individuals, and then we're going to say how many we have. And we're going to assume they're not going to have any offspring in the first year that we release them. So this might be something that would apply to a ground squirrel. And then we're going to go back every year until they're all dead. And we're going to count how many survivors there are. So we're going to have an N sub 0 and N sub 1, right? N sub 1, N sub 2, these will be decreasing every year. It's possible that 2 numbers could stay the same, but they're never going to get bigger because we're only looking at the individuals we released to begin with. Right? We aren't adding any individuals. So this is a special way we're going to set up this study to measure this information. All right. So then we can calculate this L. This is a cursive L sub X, which is short for survival. Right? How many survived the first year? Well, we're going to take our N sub 1 and divide it by the N sub 0. It's going to give us our survival in the first year. And then we're going to take our N sub 2 and divide it also by the N sub 0. So the survival rate, just like the total number of individuals, will get smaller and smaller. And it's always out of the number that we started with. So what's our survival rate starting from the very beginning? So these will be proportions. We'll calculate these as values. They'll be decimal numbers. We also want to record the births. So most of the time in demography, we start by only looking at female individuals. Right? So the females are going to be having the offspring. And so we want to count them so that we know how many moms there are. And if we go out the first year and they don't have any offspring, and we go out in the second year and they don't have any offspring, and we go out in the third year and voila, they have an offspring that year, we can see that they were not yet sexually mature in those years that they had 0 offspring, and then they become sexually mature and have their first offspring. So we're going to count how many offspring per female. So this would be like a human with only 1, right? And then as they continue through their life, as many different reproductive events as they have during their life, we're going to say, okay, this same females, they have a baby their first year, they had 1 more baby the second year, right? Maybe they had a baby every year of their life until they died. Maybe they had 6 babies, maybe they had 12, right? Or 1,000,000. We're going to try and count. So these different things we see here in this table, we can see the lifespan, how many years can they live before they all die. So the last year that's on our list here will be their lifespan. What are their survival rates? And then what are their reproductive rates? And we can also see some patterns here. So we can have an organism that only has 1 reproduction in its life. Right, so a semilparous organism. So sometimes there's trees, there's plants. Octopus also do this too. They grow until they're sexually mature, which can be a long time. And then they put all their energy into doing 1 large reproductive event and they die after that. Right? So semilparous means they only do 1 reproduction in their lifetime. If instead they do multiple reproductions, they're called itero, right? Like iterations, iteroparous. All right, 2 or more reproductions in their life. All right, so humans, although they may not choose to have multiple offspring, our biology is as an iteroparous organism, right? We are capable of having offspring about every 2 years if we chose to. All right, out in nature, organisms don't typically choose that they're going to reproduce or not. If they have enough energy in their bodies in order to make offspring, and they have a mate, and they have enough resources to survive, they're going to reproduce and they're going to try. All right, so when we look across all different organisms, we see that these kinds of patterns can be quite different, right? So here we have an example of organisms that don't live particularly long. And the males actually have a shorter lifespan than females. So when we're looking at the characteristics of our organisms, we sometimes want to see, oh, well, what do males and females have the same characteristics? Even though we're counting females in order to count the number of births, we also need to make sure that there's enough males in the population for reproduction to happen. And we may be equally as interested in studying the characteristics of the males. So when we look at different organisms, we can say, well, there's sort of this spectrum of how much energy is put into making the offspring and making each offspring. So what we see is at one end of the spectrum, humans have a life history strategy or a pattern of going about how they do their growth to sexual maturity takes a long time. Their lifespan is a long time. And we really have very few offspring over the lifespan. Even if somebody, a human female, started having offspring as soon as she was capable and continued to have offspring as often as possible. This used to happen in populations. There would be some women who might have 20, 24 kids. But at that historic time, at least half of them would die due to infectious diseases typically. So that's still a really small number of total offspring, even when we look at the maximum potential a human female might have. So when we look at how many survivors there are every year, we see this fairly flat. Like once we're born, we're pretty likely to survive until the next year, until we get to old age, and then we start to have a very low survival rate. The opposite end of the spectrum is an organism like this oyster or a clam. A lot of marine organisms, they are going to have millions of eggs. They're just going to release them out into the water. They're tiny, they're vulnerable, most of them are going to get eaten. Many of them may not even get fertilized. They'll start to grow and develop. There'll be these tiny larvae floating around. They'll get eaten. So they're going to have millions of offspring, and only a tiny fraction, maybe less than 1%, will even survive the first couple months of life. So they make huge amounts of offspring, but then most of them die. But once they do get to a big enough size, they may be able to live indefinitely after that. All right, so they've got a big hurdle to overcome surviving in their early development. But once they make it to adulthood, they have a really high survival rate. Right, so they have a really rapid decrease in numbers of individuals, and then it flattens off. So those are organisms that we typically refer to as are selected. And organisms like us that really survive really well most of their lives, we'll call them K-selected. We'll come back to why we're calling them these things in just a minute. Now, our ground squirrel is kind of in the middle there. It's equally likely to die throughout its terrifying short life. The babies get eaten, the adults get eaten, they get eaten by snakes, they get eaten by coyotes. They're sort of, it doesn't matter whether they're big or they're small, they have about as equal chance of dying. So their survival is almost linear throughout their lifespan, right? So those are an intermediate kind of life history strategy, right? So what I mean by life history strategy is all of these characteristics that go into determining how long they live, what their survival rates are. And when we think about life history strategy, it is going to be sort of all of the things that end up contributing to growth, survival, and reproduction. Right now, we were talking about evolution earlier in the semester. We were talking about the currency, how we determine success in an evolutionary context. And it's about how an individual is able to survive and reproduce compared to other individuals, right? But when we look within one species, those things don't tend to vary that much between individuals as they do between different kinds of species. But when we're looking at demographic factors, we also want to look at growth, because when we think about that an organism is taking in energy throughout its life, it is some available food resources. It can use that energy to do one of these three things. It can grow, or it can survive, or it can reproduce. It can't do all three of them equally and at maximum amount, right? So we have these sets of characteristics. It wouldn't work for humans to have a million offspring and have all of them survive, because we would end up competing with one another, and there wouldn't be enough resources available. So the very fact that we live for a long time and we have a very high survival rate has to go together with having a very low reproductive rate, right? So we don't need to reproduce very much in order to maintain the same population size. So when we're looking at the difference between an offspring and a mother, The most species are going to grow quite rapidly when they're a juvenile in order to attain a certain size that may allow them to be safer from predators, to be able to obtain resources better, to have enough energy reserves available to do reproduction themselves. So this is just an example showing um, that the juvenile is going to have a period of time in its life where it's going to use a lot of energy to grow. And then it kind of shifts that energy to being available for reproduction once it's grown to adult size. So these are the factors that we're interested in that make up the life history strategy. Another important thing about life history strategies is that these traits are connected to one another. So just like we have species that are interdependent in the environment, these life history characteristics are interdependent on one another. And so when we think about them evolving, that they are co-evolved. So the ability to survive a certain level is co-evolved with an ability to reproduce at a certain level. And so evolutionary biologists are often quite interested in studying these factors because they're the way that they evolve or the way that they differ between different organisms has a really big impact on their fitness and on whether the species is going to survive or not. All right, so I'm really interested in life history strategies, and there's some real kooky ones out there that are going to be some nice examples of the variety of different ways that organisms kind of make their living. I was fortunate to have a chance to study a few years ago, be a guest investigator on a project studying these tiger salamanders. And what happens with them is they live in a very high elevation alpine environment in Colorado, and it freezes over in the summer. And so unlike most amphibians, which would be put into the pond as eggs and they grow up as tadpoles and then they go through metamorphosis and turn into a salamander or a frog that's going to crawl out of the pond, this species and a lot of similar species instead, they often become a sexually mature adult without ever leaving the pond. They sort of make a decision, no, life's better here in the pond than it is in that upland environment, and I'm just going to stay. And so some proportion of individuals do each of those things. And so my project was looking at the proportion of individuals that go those different directions, and how when we combine the information together for both of those choices in the life history strategy, what benefit does the species get from having both of those options, right? So that's just another example of the kind of thing that we are talking about when we talk about life history strategies. All right, so I mentioned briefly that if we're doing one of these life history things, we can't do another one. And so there's experiments that have shown this idea. And the idea is there's a trade-off. All right, a trade-off is a term we're going to use to refer to if we do one thing, we can't do another. All right, so if you only have a certain amount of money, you can either pay your rent or buy groceries with it. Sometimes you can't do both, right? So if we're going to spend money on one thing, we can't spend it on something else, right? Sometimes in economics, this is also called opportunity costs. And this experiment demonstrated why a species of birds might lay a particular number of eggs, right? So when we think about, this is a small predator, a raptor, American kestrel. And these scientists did an experiment where the birds normally lay a certain number of eggs. So that's called a brood or a clutch. And the scientists were interested in, well, why do they lay that many eggs, right? So once the eggs hatch, the parents have to feed them. It's very stressful and exhausting. So why do they only say lay 2 eggs instead of 3? Right. So what they did is they took an egg from some of the nests and put it into other nests. Some of them they left the same, right? So their normal brood size were the ones that they didn't. I think they took the eggs out and then they put them back in again to sort of simulate the same treatment. So we want to do an experiment. We want to treat all of our groups exactly the same. So the normal broods were the ones that were the normal size, 2 eggs. And then they took an egg out of some of the nests and they put it in other ones. So then they had the reduced brood size, only 1 egg. And then they had the enlarged brood size that had 3 eggs. And they measured survival of the offspring and they found that it wasn't any different, right? So that's not what this graph is showing because that wasn't very interesting, right? They didn't stop there though. They kept following these, the parents through the next year. And what they found was that although they were able to raise the chicks successfully, that the extra effort of raising the additional chicks actually caused a decreased survival for the parents, right? So even though they raised 1 more chick, they didn't get an opportunity the next year to raise 2 more chicks, right? So when we look at whether this was a good strategy or not to have 2 chicks instead of 3, right? If you consider maybe they'll live 10 years, if they start by raising 3 chicks and then they die the next year, they've lost the opportunity to live 9 more years and raise 2 chicks in all of those years. So we kind of multiply those factors out. And we should see that the number of chicks that they're raising each year should maximize their lifetime reproductive potential. All right, so this is a trade-off. This is a thing where, okay, we won't raise as many chicks as we possibly could because there's a consequence for doing that, and that's decreased survival of the poor, exhausted adults after that busy summer of raising all the chicks. All right. Next topic we're going to turn our attention to is what happens to a population over time. And we can describe it mathematically. So we're going to look at that. If we go out every year and we measure how many individuals there are, we can keep track of our population size. We can keep track of our population size, and all of our graphs pretty much for this lecture are going to have time on the x-axis and capital N, which is population size. So if we only go out once a year and we count up our number of individuals and our population's increasing, we'll get a graph that's stair-stepped like this. We don't know what happened in between. So we're looking from one time to the next, the population's increasing. And we can describe what's happening on this graph by saying this is the Greek letter delta, dn dt equals little r times n. How much is our population increasing every time step? Well, that's little r, right? So little r is this difference between the one time and the next time. Right. Now little r, the simplest way we can think about it is births minus deaths. What's the increment of increase? All right, so if we have births that are higher than deaths, we're going to have an increasing population. How much is it increasing? By the difference here. So the height of our stair step. Now, if we want to do something a little snazzier and instead have a continuous time model, the graph is going to look a little different. We're continuously increasing. We're going to be able to say, again, we have time passing, we have a population size, and that we have this continuous population growth. In this case, little r is also the increment of increase, but it's mathematically means something a little different in this continuous time. We don't have a delta, now we have a dn dt like you use for calculus, and we're going to have this value little r or r max. We're going to multiply it times n, and what r is represented in this case is it's the slope. of the tangent at a point on the graph. So it's the instantaneous rate of increase, right? Which, if you have had calculus, is the first derivative. So one cool thing about population dynamics is that for me, when I started studying it, I realized that all of that calculus I had to take was really useful and important. And actually, when we're talking about population dynamics, it means something, right? It means something. And so that we can say, oh, well, that is the rate our population is increasing. So this value little r, we're going to call it our population growth rate. Right? It's a rate. That means it's going to be a certain number of individuals over a time, right? So you can also think of it as a slope. So this equation is very simple. There's a slightly different version of population growth model that you might have seen. You might have also seen it in an economics class because it's how you calculate compounding interest. If in the very specific situation where our population doubles every time step, we look at the first time we have 1, we look at the second time we have 2, because that cell divided. Each of these 2 cells divides, and now we end up with 4. Right? This doesn't happen in a lot of scenarios. You know, a human family, it goes from 2, a mom and a dad, and then we add 1 more, right? We still have the 2 we started with. Right? So this does not describe human population growth, but if we have a situation with bacteria, it describes it perfectly. We start with our starting population size, which could be 1, it could be any size we start with. They're going to double every time step, so we multiply the starting population size times 2 to the t exponent, and we'll get our population size at time t. Right, so the math here is pretty simple. Not only very specific, and we're able to write other kinds of equations if we know more about an individual species and what its reproductive pattern is. And we can use that cohort life table to get the information that we need in order to write those equations. In fact, to calculate little r. And on your homework assignment, you're going to get to fill in a cohort life table and actually use it to calculate little r for 2 species and compare kind of what their life history strategies look like. Right. So if we look at 2 different organisms that have a slightly different population growth rate. So in these equations, we've filled in little r here, right? Notice that the population with a larger value for little r is increasing faster, right? It's gotten to over 1,500 individuals after only 7 generations, whereas it takes 14 generations for the other population to get there. So the bigger the little r, the faster the population's increasing. Sometimes we talk about the x-axis on these graphs as time. Sometimes we talk about it as number of generations, right? So number of generations is if we're looking at bacteria and we go from 1 to 2, that's 1 generation. From 2 to 4, that's another generation, right? So we could say, well, it's 20 minutes and then it's 40 minutes, or then it's 2 generations, right? So we can either use actual real time, or we can say how often are they reproducing? What's the difference in age between parent and offspring? That's about what a generation is. So in humans, the average generation time is something that's around 20 years, 24 years. Right? So the difference in age between parent and offspring is a way of thinking about how long a generation time is. All right, so the way that we are showing this equation, we're basically assuming that births are always greater than deaths. That doesn't necessarily happen. And in fact, if every population of every living thing on the planet was continuously growing like this, then the earth would just be piled up with organisms, and there would be no room to do anything, and everything would die, right? So populations do not grow like this forever, right? They do not, they simply cannot, and they will not. So what happens is on this graph, we're showing a comparison between this continuous growth, uninterrupted continuous growth. And when we look at that equation, we're going to describe that pattern of growth as exponential, right? Organisms are more likely to grow in a way that has a different shape on the graph, and we're going to call that logistic, and it has kind of this S-shaped or sigmoid shape. And what happens is instead of continuously growing as fast as you possibly can, there's some feedback from the environment. And so the population doesn't keep growing as fast as it possibly can. It modifies the population growth rate by and reduces the population growth rate. So if we look at our shape of our graph here, that little r is actually changing as the population size changes, and it's changing by this factor, right? So, oops. So this factor is being shown on this equation, and it's being shown that it's multiplied by n, but a better way to think of it is that it's being multiplied by little r. So we're modifying little r, we're reducing it. What are we reducing it by? We're reducing it by the difference between the current population size and this value k, right? So for this example, k is equal to 1500. And so this term of our equation is actually k minus n divided by k, right? When n is far from k, the little r max is going to be, you're going to be growing very close to it. But when k equals n, population stops growing because that term becomes 0. And we see between 10 and 15 generations, population size is not changing over time. All right, so it has gotten to this value k, and it is now not increasing, it's steady, right? So births and deaths are equal. This value k is important because it tells us how many individuals in this population the environment can support, right? And so it's like a cap or a lid on the number of individuals that can exist in the environment. And we call this value k carrying capacity, and it depends on the environment. So in a good territory, like we were talking about earlier, a carrying capacity would be higher than in a habitat area with poor resources, right? So a carrying capacity for elephants in a certain area of the Serengeti, right, would be a small number of individuals, whereas for mice in the same area, it would be a large number of individuals, right? So it also depends on the organism and what amount of resources they use. And so for each species, there's going to be some value that is the maximum that can be sustainably supported in that environment, and we call that K. All right, so let's think back to when we were talking about different kinds of life history strategies. And I defined the one for humans where there's a really high survival rate and a long lifespan. We said, let's call those K selected. Well, it turns out that organisms with a life history strategy like that tend to stay very close to their overall K. They reproduce slowly, they don't have very many deaths in each year, so the population size doesn't change very much, it stays really stable, and they usually stay right about at K, so we call them K selected. The other kind of organism that has this incredible number of offspring all at once, it's putting lots of energy into reproduction, we call it R selected, and that's that little r, population growth rate, where you can think about it as reproductive capacity. And so a little r selected species is one that's putting a ton of energy into massive amounts of reproduction, right? And then they're hoping, they're crossing their fingers that at least a couple of offspring will eventually survive, right? So different ways of trying to go about doing the same thing. All right, so exponential growth can't happen forever. And in some species, they don't respond to the carrying capacity. So instead of having this sort of smooth approach to the carrying capacity, their graph may look like they grow exponentially for a while, and then they're going to overshoot that carrying capacity, and then some mortality event's going to happen. They've overshot their resources, right? And they're going to have this kind of collapse, and then they're going to increase rapidly again, and they're going to have another collapse, right? So these species often are our selected species. So they have a gazillion offspring, the population increases in size really rapidly, and then they all die, right? There's got to be a couple of them left behind in order to do that in the habitat again. But we often see, right, so even though they aren't going towards their carrying capacity, they still can't keep growing exponentially forever. But instead of having this slowdown of growth, they just overshoot the carrying capacity, and then they have a catastrophic die-off. So often we think about our selected species. They are species that are weeds that we might have an open area and a whole bunch of weeds would come and grow there, but they're going to grow really fast, and then they're all going to die, but their seeds are going to spread out. All right, so they have kind of this live fast, die young mentality, and they're sometimes they're also called fugitive species or weedy species. They're gonna have kind of an outbreak, and then they're gonna move on to a different location. Sometimes a predator will find them. You have a bunch of aphids on your roses, all of a sudden there will be a gazillion of them, and then all of a sudden the ladybugs will show up and they'll eat them all, and the aphids will have a population crash. All right. So even when we have a species that has a carrying capacity, they don't necessarily match it exactly. So when we grow organisms in the laboratory, we can see this happen with their populations. And on the left-hand side, we have an aquarium with paramecium in it, and we've grown them, we've provided them with a certain amount of resources, and we know how many there should be in this tank, and we can match the mathematical model or the predicted rate of growth with what we see happening in the aquarium. Some other species, they don't match quite as close to it. And what happens is they start to grow, they start to increase, and then they get really excited and they increase really rapidly, and they overshoot their carrying capacity. Well, what's going to happen after that is that now there's too few resources for the number of individuals in that environment. And so we're going to have some of them dying, right? So there's not enough resources to go around. And so the population size is going to drop again. And it may overshoot. Okay, it's going to decrease below it, but this population size is kind of wiggling around, and it's eventually going to get decay. So even though there's some feedback from the environment that once there's too many individuals in the tank and there's only enough food to go around for some of them are going to die. All right. So when we say that a population is K-selected, or that it has a carrying capacity, we're actually saying that it's capable of responding to this feedback from the environment. And so we say that the population is being regulated, right? So population regulation, like we said before, populations can't grow exponentially forever. And so population regulation comes in two kinds. There's population regulation where there's some kind of external event, there's some weather event, there's a catastrophe, there's something that causes the population. Whether the size of the population is large or small, it's whatever, individuals are going to die. So an unusual weather event is the most common example of that happening. And so we say that those population regulating mechanisms, ones that are going to cause higher deaths than births, basically, we say they're density independent because it doesn't matter how many, these are water fleas, it doesn't matter how many water fleas are in that aquarium. If somebody forgot to turn the oxygen on in the tank, they're all going to die, right? Whether there was a few of them or whether there was a lot, it's independent of the density, right? It was some other catastrophic event that was just going to kill them all off. Now, what happens when the population of its own accord gets close to the carrying capacity? It means that they're experiencing not density independent, but density dependent population regulating mechanisms, right? So density dependent population regulating mechanisms are ones that cause higher mortality or lower births as the population density increases. So in our little aquarium, we're only putting the exact same amount of food in there every day. And so as the population size increases, the amount of food that each individual is getting decreases, right? So the amount of food that each individual is getting is lower, then they're not able to reproduce as much, right? So as the population density increases, births go down, right? So any variable that we can measure that as the population density goes up, that variable goes down, right? That's going to be something that's density dependent, right? So here is another example of a density dependent population regulating factor. This is an example of soy sheep, which scientists have studied a lot because they live on an island off of Ireland or somewhere. And there's a very set population that is easy to count and whatnot. And so we've learned a lot about their biology. And so this is a graph of percentage of juvenile females producing lambs. So if you're thinking to yourself, what the heck is a juvenile? Why is it called a juvenile if it's having a baby? It turns out that they can become normally they don't become sexually mature in their first year, but when we would call them juveniles, but when the population density gets very low, more of the females become sexually mature earlier than usual, right? So when we have a very low population size of only 200 sheep, 80% of the females are going to become sexually mature in their first year. Whereas if we have 600 individuals, a higher density on the same area on the island, then less than 20% of the females will become sexually mature, right? And so how the heck does this happen? Well, hormones are an incredible and amazing thing, and the actual density of individuals, it could be having a direct effect because of exposure of hormones of other individuals and suppressing the reproductive maturity of the younger females. It could also be that the resources become scarce. There isn't enough grass for them all to eat. All the sheep get skinny and they just aren't large, and they haven't grown enough in their first year in order to be able to have a baby, right? So anytime we have something we can measure like this that contributes to births or deaths, and it changes as the population size goes up, then we would say it's density dependent, right? So these factors are things that are starting to happen as the population is approaching that carrying capacity. It puts the brakes on the population growth, and it slows down the population increase. All right. So I've got one more thing I want to talk about before we go to talking about human population. And that's something that can happen, which is a big So if we have a population that starts out stable, right, they're staying at the same N, right? So this would be a K-selected species. They're not quite at their K1 here, right? And in this case, their little r equals 0, right? So if the population size is staying the same, it's not growing, right? So B equals D. births equals deaths. Now, suppose some catastrophe, some density independent, a giant storm hits and it kills off half the sheep, right? So population size can dramatically decrease. So this part, so even though K-selected species, when they're close to K, their population size doesn't increase very fast. When their population size gets small, then they can actually grow exponentially, and they'll start growing exponentially again. Right, so we had a density independent factor that killed off a bunch of the individuals. They start reproducing more. Little r is greater than 0, so births are greater than deaths in this section, right? And for some reason, they're not paying attention to their carrying capacity. That maybe because their population size was so small, they started reproducing again. They're doing the same thing as those water fleas did, right? It's possible if they overshoot, right? So overshooting means going higher than the carrying capacity. It's possible that if they overshoot their carrying capacity, a bunch of them will start to die off, just like in the Paramecium. But if they've overshot it too far, then you can actually destroy the resources on which this population depends, right? And so if the sheep ate all the grass that was on the island at an extreme, there were so many of them, they ate it all, then they would all starve to death, right? So they destroyed their own resources. If they have destroyed their own resources to the point where they can't be supported anymore, then we say the population is going to collapse. All right, so this is a different thing happening here. This was some density independent catastrophe. They bounced back from it. Now what's happened is that they have made a big overshoot of their carrying capacity. They've destroyed the resources on which they depend, and that's going to cause a big decrease in their population size, if not elimination, right? So during these parts of the graph where the population size is decreasing, our little r is actually going to be less than 0, right? So it's defined in such a way that if the population is growing, little r is positive number, and if little r is the population is declining, then the little r is a negative number, right? So we always call it population growth rate, but if the population isn't growing, it's shrinking, and that's if the population growth rate is negative. So in this case, births is less than deaths. So what can happen after an overshoot is that the resources have actually been permanently diminished, right? So instead of being able to go back to the carrying capacity they had before, this entire population ends up at a lower total carrying capacity for the foreseeable future. So they've decreased the possible size of their population. Right, and we've seen this happen in nature, in different environments where, wolves were eliminated from a habitat and the deer population ballooned out of control because they weren't being regulated by the predator. And then they ate all, not just the leaves, but they ate the branches, they ate the trees, they sort of ate themselves out of having any kind of foods, and then they all died. So that happens. It happens. Go back to talking about human populations. All right, so let's look at the history of the human population. Here we have the same kind of graph, right? Except we've got the distant past over to the left coming up to the before the Common Era versus the Common Era. So 1,000 years ago, 1,000 or so years ago compared to the year 2000. And we see that we have this long period of time where human population is really small compared to today. And then some things change. Our population growth rate increases dramatically. Well, what happened? A couple things happened during this period of time. Right. So humans learned how to do much better at surviving and reproducing. Right. So we had developed basic sanitation, right? Having a sewer system instead of just everybody going to the bathroom into the river. We had an increase in food production. Right? So people are actually getting a lot more food to eat. And healthcare improved dramatically. So we invented antibiotics and vaccines. All right, so these are more recent. The sanitation and food productions were increasing through the 17 and 1800s until the 1900s. So we really start to have antibiotics and vaccines. And we see that the population growth rate of the human population took off dramatically at that point. Now, these things are all good. We don't want to have humans suffering, but we had this dramatic increase that started to happen in the human population, and it looked like it was just going up, up, up. As we know from population ecology, no population can grow exponentially forever. There has to be some kind of cap. All right, something is going to happen. And about the 1960s and 1970s, demographers were looking at what was happening with human populations, and they got really worried that what was going to happen with the human population, because it didn't show any signs of slowing down, was overshoot and collapse. All right, so people got really worried that the human population was getting way too big for resources available on the planet, and that the result, the inevitable result, was going to be widespread famine, starvation, that would cause a permanent loss of the ability of the planet to support human beings. This is the context for a lot of government and economic policies that were intended to decrease population growth rate. So we saw things like the Chinese government imposed the one-child policy to try and limit the population growth of their country. Other countries did different things. In general, we find where development in general is happening, especially availability of birth control and family planning, and also women's health, so that pregnancies are safe and childbirth is safe. You might think, oh, that would lead people to having more children, but it turns out that when family planning is available, people use it. And also that advances in medicine, the main result was more survival of children, so that children are more susceptible than adults to the wide variety of infectious diseases that used to prevail before we had vaccines for them. And so, like I said before, a family might have 10 or 12 children, but half of them would die in childhood, either from a disease or an accident. And so that people felt like having children was necessary and important, because you had no guarantee of all of them surviving to adulthood. In fact, that was far from what happened. All right, so the most common things that people died from before the 1950s were these contagious diseases, and that we've seen a big change in what people die from now are mostly these chronic diseases of old age, cancer, heart disease, stroke, right? So the reason for that mainly is this shift from these improvements in healthcare. All right. So demographers were really worried that what was going to happen was this overshoot and collapse. But population growth was uneven around the world at the time, because different countries had been on different historic trajectories with how these technological and family change innovations had been introduced. So we're going to look at a comparison between a highly developed, wealthy European country, Sweden, compared to a country with a colonial history that took longer for economic development to take place because of that history, and why we have different patterns in what we see with them. Right. So remember that I was telling you that around this period of time, the 1960s, 1970s, scientists were looking at this overshoot, this risk that we seem to be going towards, this overshoot and collapse. So what we see with Sweden is that the birth rate is higher than the death rate, right? We see that with Mexico, right? So the lighter colored line is showing the birth rates. If we have births higher than deaths, the population will be growing, right? So the bigger the higher the birth is from deaths, the faster the population growth rate. All right, so we see that the birth rate and death rate are both high in Sweden when we go back to 1750. And then as these inventions of technology are happening, as healthcare is improving, we're gradually seeing them implemented, we're gradually seeing them taking their effect. And so we see that both birth rates and death rates are gradually coming down. And then in fact, as people are choosing to have fewer children, the birth rates and the death rates get close together. And we see projected on this graph, projected a little after 2000 to have the birth and death rate lines, the lines cross so that the population will actually be starting to decrease. All right, what we see in Mexico is different because of their different history. That we don't even have data from further back, but we see that their birth rate's higher, right? But their death rate is also high, right? So their birth rates and death rates are both higher than in Sweden. And what happens is they start getting medical advances coming into the country, and they get everything all at once. So it isn't this sort of long, gradual, step-by-step increases that would slowly be bringing down birth rates and death rates simultaneously. So what they get is all of the sanitation, all of the medical improvements. And what that does is it rapidly changes the death rate. So it decreases the death rate a lot, and it happens over a very short period of time. And so we see that the death rate drops dramatically, right? It's actually even lower than in Sweden at about the time of this, this graph was made. But the birth rates stay high for a while, right? So people have an idea of what a family is. People have cultural practices, and even if birth control is available, they may not be choosing to use it because they think of a family, of the right kind of family as having lots of children. They love their children. And even though death rates are starting to drop, it takes longer for families to start decreasing the number of children that they have, because that's a cultural change and it isn't going to happen overnight, right? The decrease in the death rate happened really fast because it was simply a technological issue. Oh, we have this antibiotic, we can treat your family member who has this bacterial infection and they aren't going to die from it, right? But how the family looks and how many children you should have, those are very personal and cultural decisions. So we see that during this period of time, in the late 1900s, how far apart the birth and death rates are for Mexico, right? So the population the population growth rate of Mexico was increasing, right? So the death rate's decreasing, birth rate stays about the same. That means that the little r is getting bigger, right? So all these demographers that were getting worried about this overshoot and collapse, they were looking at this period of time and were feeling really nervous about the future of humanity, right? And so there were a lot of programs that were suggested to or imposed on some developing countries because that was the place where this population growth was happening, but it was happening there for these very complex and important reasons that had to do with the culture of those locations. So it took a little while for those countries to catch up in terms of their sort of matching their birth and death rates to one another. But it also has ended up happening pretty rapidly. So over 2 generations, the idea of what a family looks like has changed. It has changed in the US too. It was really common for families to have 5, 6 kids in my mom's generation, not so much anymore. So we do see these changes happening, and it doesn't take a government program to a very strict enforced government program necessarily to cause those changes to happen. So we ended up with death rates coming down first, but then birth rates eventually coming down as well, right? So how this is talked about is something called a demographic transition. We have high birth rates and high death rates, and they switch to both being low. We consider having low birth rates and low death rates a good thing, right? We want to have high birth rates and high death rates tend to go together. We don't think high death rates are good. We want people to be healthy and to have safe lives. So the switch from having high birth rates and high death rates to having low birth rates and low death rates is considered the demographic transition. So historically developed countries went through it sort of slowly and gradually, and then less developed countries tended to sort of do it with this awkward time lag, right? So now what we want to think about is what's happening with the human population now. And this graph is a little more up to date, but notice it has 2 lines on it. And this is sort of zoomed in, and it's showing the population in billions, right? So now we're looking at from 1930 projected out into 2050. And we're over 7 billion humans on the planet. And our human population size continues to increase. All right, the size continues to increase. But the rate of increase is decreasing. So we see this graph in red, and this red line is starting to go down, right? That's the annual growth rate. So that's little r, right? So our little r is decreasing. And globally, this has started to happen. There are many countries that have actually a negative population growth rate now. And what's happening is that we have now populations that are dealing more with diseases of old age than with those childhood diseases. All right. So when we think about how many people can live on the planet, now we are starting to have our human population size decreasing, but the amount of people that can live on the planet, what is the carrying capacity for the human species on our planet? Well, it depends. It depends on whether you're a human that uses a high amount of resources or you're a human that doesn't use a high amount of resources. So based on development, there is a very different amount of resource use. We think about it just as food. The total amount of food that can be produced on the arable land, which is land that is useful for farming, is 11.9 billion gigahectares, right? That's something that we can't increase much beyond what it already is, right? And so our ecological footprint per capita, per person, is higher in some countries and lower in others, right? So we couldn't have 10 billion people on the earth that are all consuming at the very highest levels of consumption. We can have quite a few more people than we have now, as long as we aren't all consuming at those highest rates of consumption, right? So we have to take into account the, these vast differences in the amount of resources that people in different areas of the globe are using when we try and think about what is the carrying capacity for humans on the planet. All right, so there's a happy story here that the human population doesn't any longer seem to be headed for this overshoot and collapse. Um, as far as resources go on the planet, not that we don't have other issues to worry about, but from a population biology perspective, we seem to be going in the right direction.